everybody. Welcome back to another episode of The Riley Lewis Show. I'm your host. We have a lot of news to cover today, so let's just jump right into it. So we begin today with a landmark Supreme Court decision that occurred just yesterday on Monday, what is being called a watershed moment, which is a good thing, in the LGBTQ plus community, is a decision that by the Supreme Court that says that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does in fact provide protection for sexual orientation and gender identity. This protection is from discrimination in the workplace of any kind. In other words, so we had, very interestingly, this was a 6-3 decision for the bench, and Neil Gorsuch, who was actually President Trump's first appointee to the Supreme Court, along with, 5 other justices who voted in favor of this ruling, have now basically legally ensured protection for members of the LGBTQ plus community, as well as all people, frankly, from discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity, along with the original Civil Rights Act, which says race, color, creed, national origin. Moving on, I'm not a legal scholar, but I do want to just cover my bases here, so I'm going to read you the specific language of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which goes, quote, this title prohibits employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, and now sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, predictably, there are going to be people who debate the exact wording of each of these terms and the actual terms that are covered in the umbrella LGBTQ+, and this is really just something that I think is clearly really a distraction from what's going on, and I actually think this is a good decision, and I'll explain why I think this is a good decision. This is sort of where my libertarian conservative perspective meets the progressive left, in the sense that I really just believe in absolute freedom of expression, freedom of identity, freedom of speech, freedom of mind, body, and spirit, and the pursuit of happiness, by the way. And furthermore, I don't think that it's any of the government's business what you decide to do with your life, how you live your life, as long as you're not hurting other people, you're not intentionally, fomenting insurrection or causing terror or chaos, you're just sticking to yourself and living a good, virtuous life, then I don't really think any of that information matters. The only thing that matters to me is that we're all living here together on the same planet or in the same country in this sort of Parliament of Nations global situation, and we're all just trying to figure out how to live. So I really don't think it's any of the government's business. So I'm actually on board with this decision by the Supreme Court. I think people should have every right to determine their identity in all facets, their pronouns, their name, and all acts that they engage in consensually with other people. None of this really should change the way that we treat each other, by the way, so I don't think that any of that is really materially important. We should treat each other with dignity and respect regardless, and I think that this was a decision that goes in that direction. Now, one of the arguments that surrounds this case is whether or not this was a judgment or a legislation. We hear that all the time, litigation versus legislation, meaning did the Supreme Court interpret the law as it is written and make a judgment about whether or not it violated the Constitution, or did they decide to effectively update the Civil Rights Act to reflect contemporary society, which would be legislation more so than litigation? Now, as I said before, this is really an interesting case for me because it's sort of a blend of this new order American liberalism, but also some libertarian non-interventionism, and for me personally, some Burkean conservatism, which I know sounds confusing, but really this is all to say that this is about the right of the individual. And I've slowly been lately becoming more pro-choice across the board. Lately I'm absolutely on the side of individuals' self-determination and their right to live their life as they see fit in the world that they see fit to live it in. And I don't really think that that's the government's business. I think that's where I would draw the line. I think that the government needs to know that who's here and we're obeying the laws and what we're doing. But aside from taxes and some other stuff that's really important, I don't think that any of that personal stuff is the government's business. But labels aside, I really do think this is a good decision because I don't think that the government should be regulating people, I guess is what I'm saying. I don't think that the government should be regulating people's self-expression or limit their opportunities or their lifestyle based on any possible number of ways that you could categorize a human being. I don't really think it's the government's job to just try to put human beings into a box. I think it's their job to create a world in which we can flourish and to meet the needs of the people, and we will articulate those needs, and they're supposed to listen. And the only thing that matters really finally is that we are human beings who need to find ways to effectively govern ourselves. That said, let's move on to another interesting Supreme Court, actually non-decision in this case, but still very important nonetheless, that happened yesterday as well, when the bench decided not to reinvestigate a police protection law that was put into place by judges years and years ago. Now, this law has been referred to as qualified immunity, which really is actually something that basically says that people can't really bring forward petty lawsuits or constantly go after police and make accusations. It's supposed to be something that gives police a little bit of leeway to actually do their job. However, we've seen significant public outcry lately when that really has disguised or provided legal protection for officers who practice or malpractice. Officers who abuse their power are also able to be shielded by this law. Nina Totenberg at NPR published a piece about this yesterday, reminding us of really two key questions that are embedded in the qualified immunity doctrine that protects police. The first question is, did the police use excessive force, which we've seen a lot of lately? Following this first question is another one, and if they did, should they have known that their conduct was illegal because it violated a clearly established prior court ruling that barred such conduct? That's where the problem comes in, because the Supreme Court has refused to hear any case on this or review any case. By the way, it takes 4 Supreme Court justices voting in favor of that to do that. Because we have not seen that, there is no precedent or legal prior or any other established court ruling in this direction that basically prosecutes a police officer for misconduct. And because we don't have that in the Supreme Court, that means that lower courts are able to shield police officers and their conduct because they can point to the fact that there is no precedent set in law. Now, obviously, the original intention of the law was, again, to shield police officers from random accusations or frivolous lawsuits, especially considering the fact that police officers are often in dangerous situations to precipitate a split-second decision. That said, when several of those split-second decisions result in the murder or especially unnecessary or brutal, cruel murder of an alleged suspect or perpetrator, now we have a problem. The problem here is that the designated protection service, the police, is actually in some cases more dangerous than they are helpful. And this really does include multiple murders recently even by police officers, and the number for the United States annually is over 1,000, or averages around 1,000 annually, and that's a lot of people. So this is obviously a hot button issue in the news lately, especially with all of our demonstrations and our protests. Now again, as I said, it takes 4 Supreme Court justices to review a case, but there are 2 associate justices on the bench right now. Interestingly, the most liberal and the most conservative, Sonia Sotomayor and Clarence Thomas, who have actually called for a review of this qualified immunity doctrine, which is being used to protect police officers. Sotomayor has criticized the doctrine, referring to it as, quote, an absolute shield for law enforcement officers, which really it has been. So furthermore, there have been, again, these lower level courts that are able to dismiss police misconduct cases on the grounds of the qualified immunity doctrine and the lack thereof of a previous court decision by the Supreme Court. In addition to any lack of, in addition basically to a complete lack of any precedent ever that condemns this sort of police behavior that's in question. That said, I do think that the appetite for police reform is much stronger than the urge to resist the reform. I don't really think that there's any stopping. I don't think you can stop that train, I guess is what I'm saying. I think that we have reached a point of no return in which there will be massive police reform, and police unions will fight it. But I think that at this point, regardless of the Supreme Court's decision, police reform will be something that happens, and it will be widespread. It's already started in New York. For example, Andrew Cuomo, as I previously reported, has already signed 10 new policing bills into law, or reportedly, and that's just one example. Moving on, though, with another story about the economic impact of the coronavirus, and some of the ripple effects. The coronavirus outbreak, as you know, really it's no secret at this point, has resulted in an unprecedented global economic disaster that really dwarfs the Great Depression in the 1930s in the United States. Nearly 40 million people alone filed for unemployment, filed for unemployment, I should say, in a period of about 3 months, including 20 million people who lost their jobs just this past April. And now it's June. The only relief we've seen is one payment of $1,200. Obviously, there have been some other supplemental things for business owners and stuff and sole proprietors, but the economic impact of the outbreak has been disastrous and catastrophic, and really, this situation for many people has been a hellacious nightmare. This was really also, by the way, enough to break the bank for most people. So for all of the hard work to try to uplift people out of poverty, it's these events that lower people or put people who've recently lifted out of those means. Those people are the most at risk, I should say. So when we have an economic shutdown, it's not the rich folks who are going to get hurt the worst. It's the people who are working 2 jobs, Domino's and McDonald's, who are going to get hurt the worst. According to an article in the Washington Post written by David Lynch, it says, quote, "What began in China 5 months ago as a distant threat to U.S. factory supply chains has evolved into a mammoth shortfall in consumer and business spending that could hobble the economy for years. For years." And that's just our best estimate. Economists still really don't know what the global ripple effects of this shutdown will be, and that's assuming that we don't have another shutdown. That said, Lynch highlights one of my main concerns about the economic result of the lockdown, a concern that I've had since the beginning of the lockdown, which is again the fact that low-income and low to middle-income workers are going to be hurt the most, which means that we have a lot of people who are in jeopardy of losing their retirement, their financial futures, maybe their entire livelihood. So for some people, this isn't just about even losing a job, it's about losing their entire livelihood, which ultimately can lead to death. I mean, anyway, moving on, I just say that because there's this mainstream media narrative that the shutdown really has really just been some sort of, Parisian vacation, and people are just getting haircuts at home and posting about it online and saying stuff like hashtag it'll grow back. But that's if you're privileged enough to be able to afford a 4-month staycation. Most Americans and most people around the world cannot afford a 4-month staycation where, they can just practice cutting each other's hair. Most people literally need to be working, or else their entire way of life disappears. And which brings us to an interesting figure mentioned in this article. National unemployment peaked in the United States in April of this year at just under 15%, and this number was much higher in some specific areas of the country. For example, unemployment in Muskegon County, a county in Michigan, in western Michigan, climbed as high as 29%. According to this article by David Lynch. The statistic, by the way, really does fuel people's concerns about their financial futures, any debt that they have, any student loans that they may have that are being deferred or on hold, and for many people, even just making their rent on time. It's reported that in the first 3 months of the global economic shutdown, approximately $6.5 trillion in household wealth was gone. Indeed, economists are still really worried that the ripple effect from the economic disruption will continue to result in job losses in both the United States and around the world. The response by so many governments to completely shut down has been, again, for some, a staycation. But, a staycation filled with at-home haircuts, DoorDashed meals, countless movie nights, but for millions of other people around the world and in this country, this was arguably the most difficult time in their lives, or in at least recent living memory. Millions of Americans are currently scrambling to pick up the pieces of their lives, and economists are uncertain of how long it will take for the global economy to rebound. Now, last Wednesday, the chairman of the the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, issued a statement about the economic shock, saying that this is, quote, the biggest economic shock in the US and in the world in living memory. Powell continued to say, quote, we went from the lowest level of unemployment in 50 years to the highest level in close to 90 years, and we did it in just 2 months. Of course, all of this points to the complicated question in the room, which is how do we balance public safety and the coronavirus response with also reopening the global economy and the US economy? How do we make it so that people are safely able to get back to their life? How do we do that how do we do those things simultaneously? That's the $1,000,000 question. If you have an answer, please leave it for me in the feedback section or in the comment section down below, but that's really the $1,000,000 question. And finally, it's also complicated by the fact that the virus has hit each state differently. So many different, every state looks different, basically, the situation on the ground. So it's more appropriate for some states to open to certain degrees over other states, but to what extent, how soon, do we implicate do we employ another phase sort of idea where we gradually reopen? In any case, there are certain states that really are sort of just going full, not full reopen, but moving pretty closely to reopening. Speaking of that, in the state of Texas, Governor Greg Abbott is introducing a plan that really just is sort of been dubbed the "It's Your Responsibility" plan, meaning how much risk are you willing to accept as an individual? If you want to go get your haircut at a salon instead of at your house by your family members, that's okay. But you're the one who's consenting to taking on that risk. So it's your responsibility to be safe and also to understand that what you're doing might be risky. And so it's also an opportunity for the individual to come in and say, how much risk am I willing to tolerate? So again, Greg Abbott, the Texas governor, has adopted this strategy for reopening places responsibly and cautiously during, for the duration of the process. But in other words, he's again leaving it up to the individual to determine how much risk they are willing to tolerate. Abbott officially began relaxing statewide restrictions on May 1st, acknowledging that this would likely contribute to an increased spread of the virus. However, Abbott did claim that more cases are acceptable so long as they do not overwhelm the hospital system, which, if you recall, was the original goal of the lockdown nationwide, to make sure that we do not overwhelm the hospital system. But it was not necessarily this idea that we lock down until we know that we have a vaccine again. It was lockdown until we know that even with cases, we are not overwhelming the healthcare system. According to Texas Monthly, Texans abided strictly by the rules of the lockdown early in an effort to help flatten the curve, as we heard in the mainstream media. However, this attitude did change over time due to civil unrest, economic stress, and a relatively low impact from the virus. That said, if reopening too soon contributes to the spread of the virus because the lockdown was responsible for part of the containment early on, then this is a measure that undermines the containment effort overall. Additionally, as I reported yesterday, hundreds of new studies support the notion that wearing a mask, for example, does slow the spread of the coronavirus in some settings. However, it is not definitive, according to the authors of the study, or the authors of the review of these studies, that masks work the same way in all settings. So even for Americans that are just wondering, mask, no mask, it's quite confusing. Now, one narrative that I've previously stated and talked about is this idea that people who are concerned about the economy are really mostly concerned about stuff like getting haircuts, because really most people who were protesting during the lockdown, like the people who were protesting police brutality, are also in a fight for their life. If your entire business, your entire way of life, your entire retirement savings, all of your 401k, if everything that you own has been liquidated and lost because of a global economic shutdown, I mean, you're on the brink of starvation. You're on the brink of displacement and homelessness and eviction. I mean, these are very real problems that are just as threatening as a virus, just in a different way. Plus, again, all of this said, staying home all for 4 months, and we're supposed to last on a one-time payment of $1,200. That's just absurd. So it doesn't. At this point, we have to reopen, but we can do it safely. But at this point, I don't think that we can handle being locked down anymore. And I also don't think that we can handle another lockdown, such as what Governor Andrew Cuomo is proposing, which brings us to our final story, about, again, Andrew Cuomo, who has been basically threatening that if certain businesses who are reopening do not abide by the state rules, that there will be another lockdown, which I think would be really enough to break the bank for a lot of people, and I think that would spark even more outrage, public outcry, even more protests. I don't see how that ends in any positive way. And again, this lockdown has impacted each state in different ways. The state of New York was hit particularly hard, especially New York City. So public safety concerns really do need to be addressed, especially in the state of New York. That is an example where the outbreak resulted in a catastrophe that was far worse than a place like Idaho or Montana or South Dakota. And over as we've been reopening, we've been having seeing more residents in the city, such as over this past weekend when there were Pride celebrations. We saw people in the streets. We saw people in New York City socializing in bars with their friends, maybe for the first time in months, but maybe not. But Governor Cuomo, basically in response, who I should say also, by the way, Governor Cuomo, in his defense, has received as many as 25,000 complaints reportedly about businesses that are not operating within state social distancing guidelines. But that said, after weeks of protests, demonstrations, various other mobilizations, it seems like the government stopped caring about it for a little while. So businesses started to relax their protocols, and people started to gradually become less concerned with social distancing. Frankly, the media has cried wolf too many times, and now people don't want to hear what the talking heads or even the experts have to say anymore because they keep flip-flopping like a fish out of water. Now, some of the major violators of social distancing, according to the New York Times, include bars and their customers, specifically in Manhattan and in Long Island. And Governor Cuomo has warned that if local law enforcement does not crack down on this behavior, there will likely be a second outbreak, and that would most likely, for him, require another lockdown. Now, I do find all of this, honestly, to be incredibly ironic, because state officials were basically asking local police to not enforce social distancing rules during the recent protests, which, I understand were justified, but still, it's like we have thousands of people in the streets who are protesting, and the governor doesn't say a word about it, not at all. And in fact, if you are someone who mentions healthcare or, a concern about the coronavirus, I should say, during these protests, you were regarded or considered to be insensitive. But now Governor Cuomo has basically on a dime changed his mind and decided he needs local law enforcement to actually enforce the law. So it's like we have this is just really indicative of our capricious, fickle, disarrayed system of standard operating procedures, but also, in my opinion, political corruption. People are willing to overlook the coronavirus when they support the cause, and they don't care if it spreads. In fact, people in law enforcement are being told, and people in healthcare are being told, not to ask people who test positive whether or not they attended a protest or a demonstration. But now, if someone wants to go see their friend at a bar in the city, Cuomo threatens another lockdown. Honestly, I think that Governor Cuomo has completely botched this entire thing, and I think that this is just another example of someone who really just can't even seem to run their own state effectively. It's just frustrating because it looks like sometimes we want law enforcement, then one minute we hate law enforcement, we literally want to defund and abolish it, then the next minute we want law enforcement to help with the crackdown. So it's like, do we want law enforcement or do we not want? Do we want law enforcement or do we not want law enforcement? We can't have both at the same time, where it's abolished, defunded, and also we really need it in certain times of crisis. So I think that's why I'm frustrated. But anyway, moving on back to this article, Dr. Michael Osterholm. This article mentions Dr. Michael Osterholm, who was recently featured on the Joe Rogan Experience, who is the director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota. Osterholm, in an interview on Fox News this past Sunday, claimed that the quote virus is not going to rest until it infects between 60 and 70% of the population. That is the threshold in absence of a vaccine, at which point herd immunity is reached. This idea being that the virus will either be stopped with an artificial vaccine that we invent, or it will be stopped because the population will basically build up herd immunity, which was Sweden's strategy really the whole time. Now, I'm not a medical expert, and if you are interested in more information about the coronavirus, please do not let me be your only source. I highly recommend seeking out the opinions of our top health officials and our experts, despite the fact that they are sending conflicting messages. I do think that it's important to listen to them and to say that every episode when I talk about coronavirus. But really, this is where I want to summarize. I want to bring things back to center. In summary, we do need to make sure that we do all that we can to prevent the spread of the virus. Also, I don't think that this country or any country in the world can handle another global economic shutdown. It would put millions of people, it would jeopardize the livelihood of millions and millions and millions and millions of people. And I think what we saw in the first response was we saw a lot of people infected by the coronavirus, but for the 100,000 in the United States, we saw 40 million people lose their jobs. And so we're definitely seeing a disproportional we're definitely seeing the burden is being distributed disproportionately, and I think that the end goal is to get us through this with minimal disruption to people's lives and with minimal impact. So I think that we need to start talking about reopening as much as we can, but also talk about things like distance learning or hybrid learning, hybrid working, and new ways to socialize and stuff like that. That said, okay, everybody, that's a wrap for today's episode because I'm rambling. As always, I appreciate your time today. If you would like to support me, please hit that subscribe button down below, and you can like this video also. I really appreciate it. It really helps me out. There's also a link in the description to my Patreon page down below where you can go there, you can sign up, become a member, and then you can make a donation to support me. But in any case, I will see you here again tomorrow. You've been listening to The Riley Lewis Show.